Chapter 30. Pizzeria Pepper was in many ways the pride of the Arenal. It had been there since 1983. Angelica has never seen it anything other than completely full when she walked past with Tommy. She had been a couple of times, and it served amazing Italian food, meats, seafood, pizzas, pastas, and some of the very best desserts she had ever eaten. Javea had chosen the place primarily because there was so much variety on the menu that you could always find something you wanted. Arriving at the venue, it was clear that the manager knew Javea well. They spoke quietly in Castilian at some speed, far too quickly and quietly for Angelica to keep up. When their 30-second conversation had finished, the manager showed Angelica and Javea to their table. It was along the front of the venue, so they had uninterrupted views of the promenade, yet somewhat interrupted views of the beach and sea. There were so many people walking along, taking in the pleasant warmth of the evening that someone walked past every few seconds. It didn't matter. Angelica and Javea could still see what was going on along the entirety of the Arenal. It was a scene of activity, but none of it too frantic. People lived life at an entirely different pace to what she had grown used to in the northeast of England. The bread and aioli arrived at the table within a minute, accompanied by a waiter who smiled the biggest smile Angelica had seen for weeks, save the one she had got from Javea when she arrived to meet him earlier that evening. She wondered if she was one of the reasons people brought out their best smiles. She tried to smile as much and as widely as possible, teaching Tommy that you should be the rainbow to everyone else's clouds. "What would you like to drink?" the waiter asked her. She pondered if she was so obviously English that everyone else could spot it. "Gin and tonic," she replied, giving the matter no more thought. So what if she was recognised as English? It made the language difficulties disappear. Javea nodded at the waiter to indicate that he wanted the same. Angelica had never put him down as a G&T drinker. In fact, she had never put him down as a drinker full stop. They waited for the drinks, looking out towards the sea and taking in the scene without talking. There was no need to fill the silent spaces with conversation. That was one of the reasons Angelica liked being in Javea's company. It was relaxed. Well, aside from the hesitation she had shown earlier that day, that was behind her now. The waiter took their order as he bought the drinks. Javea went for a spicy pizza with sausage. Angelica loved pizza, but hadn't got used to the way they served it in Spain. There were too many toppings, and none of them seemed to go together for her liking. If you wanted a pizza without ham on, then you were usually out of luck in a Spanish pizzeria. Instead, she went for the sea bass. It was cooked in the red-hot ovens, the same way as the pizzas, and the waiter told her it had been caught that very day. Landed, he said. Landed. She loved the way one word meant very different things because of the context. Landing a fish was different to the landing the Moors had done many centuries before, and different again still from the piece of a house at the top of the stairs. She marvelled at how someone could learn a new language, and despaired at her attempts to learn Spanish. If they had one word that meant multiple things, then she had no chance, Angelica mused. The food was amazing, every single bite of it, and once the drink flowed, Javea had ordered a bottle of Tempranillo to go with the dinner. Then the conversation flowed with it. They talked about life, past loves, work, family, and football. As far as football went, Angelica only knew what she had heard from Tommy, but it seemed like Javea was a bit of an expert. She would have to get the two of them together to talk endlessly about the subject one day. She knew for a fact that Tommy could talk about it all day and then still continue the conversation in his sleep. The conversation was light. Angelica appreciated that. It wasn't until the end of the night, half a bottle of wine and 3 G&Ts, in that she plucked up the courage to ask something that had been on her mind all day. Chapter 31. Javi, there's something I've been meaning to ask about. Surprise me. Is it something to do with the Hugo Cruz killing? Javi asked, chuckling. He knew that Angelica had one eye on danger all her life, the other eye on Tommy. Is it that obvious? Yes, there's only so much I can tell you, obviously. Hugo was a complicated character. I went to school with his sister, even went round to her parents' house to play when I was a kid. And I didn't even know that Hugo existed. How come? He didn't live in the area. Were his parents separated? No, not that. He was in a youth prison. He killed someone else at school. A fight went too far. One boy got killed, another was sent to prison until he was nearly 30. And now he's dead, Angelica added, stating the obvious. Yes, and I'll be following him if I ever get you into trouble. Your brother will come after me. You know when he was here he asked me to keep you away from trouble. Augustine, he doesn't know what I want or need in life. It's all very well and good being the big brother from a distance, but his imagination is bigger than the reality, much bigger. Angelica spoke with a clarity that stopped Javi in his tracks. He knew 2 things from the time he had spent around Angelica. The first one was that she would do her own thing, no matter what others said. And the second one was that she was far stronger and smarter than anyone gave her credit for. Chapter 32. Clearly hooked on the information Javi had given her the night before, Angelica was up early, fighting off the slight hangover that was nuzzling at the back of her head and the bottom of her stomach. She looked online and found information about the killing that involved Hugo Cruz, the first one when he was just a schoolboy. She found out that the person he had killed was called Enrico Moro, and she researched the rest of Enrico's family. Well, as much of that as she could. There was little to go on. So little to go on. The mother was buried nearby. The younger brother and the father seemed to disappear off the records around the same time the mother died. Angelica clicked and clicked until she had read all of the articles related to Enrico, the parents, the brother, and Hugo Cruz. Exhausting the available information online, she wondered what detectives did in the days before the internet. The same information was still out there, but it was contained in the memories of people or the archives of newspapers. Nothing as close to hand as firing up a computer screen and pressing a few buttons. She marvelled at the age she lived in before getting Tommy out of bed and telling him that they were going out for breakfast before school. This hardly ever happened, so Tommy was excited beyond belief. She told him it was a treat because she had been out for something to eat the night before with Uncle Javi, as she had grown used to calling him. The real reason was that she wanted to visit the grave as soon as possible. It just felt right. Even if it didn't lead anywhere with the investigation, Angelica felt like she should pay her respects to a woman who was so determined. If Angelica had half that determination, then she was sure she would go a long way in life, and take Tommy with her too. The drive to the graveyard was sort of on the way to the port, which itself was generally in the same direction as Tommy's school. If she hurried, then she would get to visit the grave, get breakfast, and have Tommy into school on time. At the graveyard, the feeling that this wasn't a single grave was powerful. It was the biggest plot in the cemetery, but with a single headstone. The dug earth around the plot was years old, but it was still obvious from the different direction the grass grew in that the area dug was far wider than just for one person. She imagined two of them lying there together, the husband joining the wife in eternal connection. Angelica didn't know if she would be buried alone or with someone else. As it stood, she would be on her own. Tommy might join her, but she hoped that event would be a generation after her own demise. Tommy sat in the car on her phone, playing whatever game he had most recently downloaded. He played a game with fury for a few weeks and then decided to replace it with the next big thing. Well, the next big thing according to all his mates at school. She took one last look at the grave, thanked Mrs. Morrow for her tireless work, and walked back to the car. She got there just in time. Chapter 33. Javea and Kiki agreed not to leave the office until they had brainstormed some decent leads to follow up. The fact that the temperature outside was already touching 30 meant that the office was closer to 40. Agreeing to stay in this hot box indicated they really meant business. Kiki had already spoken to a few old school friends of Enrico and Hugo, the ones that she could trace from a school photo that appeared in the local newspaper just before the time of the killing. Their class had been selected for a foreign trip to Belgium as part of a cultural exchange, as well as to practice the French that the class had been building up over the previous 2 years. It was good news at the time. Good news always made it to the middle pages of a newspaper, especially a local one. Enrico and Hugo hadn't made it to the trip. One was dead and the other locked up. There wasn't a great deal of information forthcoming from the people who were kids at the time and had added decades of life since. Memories from a few weeks ago were often sketchy. Memories from decades before had been altered, rationalised, or pushed back to the darkest recesses of the mind. One of them had spoken about money. Nothing specific, but he mentioned that money was always a hot topic of conversation in the Morrow family whenever he visited. It's strange what memories the brain conjures up when prompted. I had no idea that was in there, but when you asked a few questions it arrived at the forefront of my head, the old classmate explained. Kiki recorded her calls so she didn't have to make notes, and a piece of software transcribed it into English and Spanish so she could upload the word-for-word document to the system. Javea had no idea how she learned so much about technology. She was 15 years younger, so must have grown up with it, he concluded. And that led me to look for the will, Kiki explained to Javea. I spoke to around 10 solicitors in the town before I found the one that had it registered. He has emailed me a copy. Fancy that, a solicitor that uses email. I didn't think I'd ever see the day. And it splits the entire estate of the mother in half. All the assets were in her name, none in the name of her husband. The property they lived in, one that they rented out in the hills, plus savings and investments well into the tens of thousands of euros. The thing is, nobody has ever claimed these possessions. The father and brother haven't showed up for years, and they haven't made a claim for their share of the money and assets. That feels strange, Javea said, wanting a coffee more than ever. When you took something away from him, he desired it even more. He made a pact to move forward before he left the room. He had to stick to it. So, where do we go from here? He asked. They both stopped in their tracks. This wasn't going to be easy. Chapter 34. Angelica took the phone away from Tommy at just the right time. It had only been in her hand for a matter of seconds when 2 messages flashed up. She opened the first. It only took a few words for her to recognise the tone. It was another abusive message, threatening both her and Tommy. The tears welled up in her eyes as she closed the message down. Are you okay, Mummy? Tommy asked. Her upset had created an atmosphere that filled the car. He was a sensitive child, understanding instinctively when his mother wasn't quite herself. Yes, I'm okay, baby. It's just really dusty out there and I got some in my eye, she lied, hoping her words would calm him where her body language wasn't offering the same level of calm. Then why are both eyes crying? He asked. Both eyes, baby. I just got dust in both eyes, but I'm okay to drive, and I guess your tummy is rumbling. Are you ready for breakfast? Yeah, pancakes. Pancakes it is. Do you think they'll have enough pancakes for both of us? Angelica asked, trying to play a role of happiness. It wasn't difficult with her loving child sat next to her. She needed to protect him from all the hurt in the world, even if she had to take it all on herself. If they don't have enough, then we can share, Tommy offered. She had brought him up well. That sounds like a plan, she countered, starting up the car and checking all the mirrors to ensure it was safe to move off. She wiped her tears on the sleeves of her t-shirt. Getting to the restaurant and ordering 2 plates of pancakes, she was able to put Tommy's mind at rest that he was going to get a sufficient breakfast. Why he ate a stack of pancakes when they went out when he was more than full by eating a single bowl of cereal at home puzzled her, but she wanted a child with a healthy appetite, so didn't complain. The settled look on his face as they both tucked into their breakfast gave Angelica the courage to look at the second message. It was from a different number, but that wasn't unusual from the vile person sending her abusive messages. But it wasn't her stalker. Checking further, the second message was from her brother, Augustine. Patty is out. These were the 3 words she had feared for so long. The abusive message had put her back up, bringing all her guards with her. The message had made her believe that it could only be Patty, her ex and Tommy's father. He was the only enemy she could think that she had on the planet. Angelica texts back. 2 words, shorter than the message she had received from Augustine. I know. Chapter 35. Heads had been scratched, fingernails bitten, and the ceiling stared at far too much than it should be. Javea and Kiki had agreed not to leave the room until they had something they could label as progress. It hadn't happened to that point. Mouths opened, but no sound came out. It was like the kernel of an idea disappeared when it was given the light of day. Opening the mouth allowed sunlight to disintegrate the formulation of infant ideas. They would never grow up. Silence could be comfortable, just like the one between Javea and Angelica at times, but it could also be the most uncomfortable sound in the world. It could invade all the senses and leave the people enveloped in the silence about as comfortable as they could ever be. No wonder it was used as a torture tactic. Then the silence was broken. Javea was sure it was he who would come up with the solution, but it wasn't. What about the man who was supposed to be on the horse? Kiki asked, now desperate to get out of the room and get some fresh air. The windowless room smelled faintly of sweat. It wasn't a criticism of Javea. He was here in this small room for hours at a time. The aircon was intermittent, the ventilation non-existent. That's genius. It's amazing what the mind can conjure up when faced with the dire consequence of being stuck in a room with me, Javea quipped. Kiki had already moved on. She had dialed the number for the organiser of the Moors and Christians festival, a number she had become used to, dialing over the previous day or so. Hola? Javea listened to one side of the conversation. He could hear Kiki, but she hadn't put it on speakerphone. He gathered what was going on from the single voice he could hear. Yes, it's Kiki from the local police. I have a question or 2. 2 minutes, 3 maybe. Who was the man who was supposed to be on the horse? The horse that Hugo Cruz died on. Right, I'll hold. Thank you. Kiki wrote down a name. Any more details? Kiki wrote down a few more words. Thank you so much for your time. Javea sat with bated breath. The anticipation overtook the previous tension. The room was filled with a different kind of energy. Kiki clicked away at the computer in front of her, smiling as she did. Kiki was patiently aware that Javea would be watching her every move, waiting for her to give him the information she had just gathered. But she wanted to make him wait. It was a game in one way, but she also wanted a complete picture to present to her boss, or as close as possible to a complete picture. Artie Jackson, a British expat, should have been on the horse. The organiser hadn't thought to find out why Artie wasn't on the horse. He's making some inquiries of his own, but he doesn't have the advantage of our system, Kiki explained, tapping the computer screen like it was an old friend giving her a hand. And? Artie Jackson. Cal de Bologna, Block C, Apartment 23. Javea smiled at Kiki as she passed him a piece of paper with all the information on. The information she had just retrieved. She was very good at what she did. Maybe he would get her out and about with him more often. To make that happen, he'd had to complete paperwork, make requests to his superiors, sit in a meeting to explain his reasons, and that was before Kiki herself had to go through an interview process. But he had to act. If he didn't look after Kiki, then she would look elsewhere to further her career. And she deserved it. Chapter 36. Angelica dropped Tommy off at school and then decided that a walk was the best way to work her way through the upset of the message, coupled with the fact that Patty was out of prison. She would later text Augustine to find out exactly when Patty was released, and when Patty knew about his impending release. He was the kind of person who would let things stew, building up until they exploded, and that explosion was more often than not either violence or the threat of violence. She learned later that Patty was released only the day before, and that he probably knew about it for a few weeks. It was more recently than when she started receiving the menacing messages, but the frequency had increased in a similar period of time. It could be Patty. In fact, Angelica couldn't think of anyone else that would want to send her such vile words. Unless... She had been involved in a few murder cases now. The first one was the death of her close friend, killed by another of her close friends. And there have been a handful since. Maybe one of the people who she had helped bring to justice held a grudge. She had no idea who it was. But Angelica knew that she needed to find out who it was and put it to an end. For her own sake, and the sake of her son Tommy too. Angelica ebbed and flowed between feeling safe and feeling in danger as she walked. The car was far behind her, the apartment far ahead. She didn't have her safe places to fall back on. Angelica would have to work her own way through this. Her thoughts bounced around inside her head like they were the only possible things she could occupy her time and mind with. What is going on? Patty could be here right now, couldn't he? Did he have the capacity to be released from prison yesterday and then be here today? Is he watching me here now? Is he in that bush, that car? Has he already got the drop on me by picking Tommy up from school? Does he have the right to travel out of the UK? Will someone have already told him where I am, where Tommy is? The thoughts caused her to stop, doubled over with fear. But Angelica wouldn't give in to the fear. She was strong. She would fight anyone for the safety of her son, even if that was a man who caused her so much pain and fear in the past. Angelica resolved that he wouldn't be able to do that again in the future. Now she had to deal with the present. Chapter 37. As he turned the corner to Cal de Bologna, Javea was faced with a sight he hadn't witnessed for quite some time. 2 cats were going for one another in the middle of the street, scratching, biting and screeching at the top of their lungs. Territory was hugely important to felines. They marked places that they thought were their own, never to be trespassed by another. Javea guessed that one cat had taken liberties. The other was trying to defend what it thought was rightfully theirs. If he was a cat detective, then this would be an easy case to resolve. But he wasn't. He dealt with divisive, evasive humans who hid everything in case they appeared guilty, even when they were innocent. Rather than break up the fight or wait for it to finish, Javea decided to park his car and walk the rest of the way. Only a few hundred yards. Javea recalled one of the lessons from his early days in the police. Look up. Everywhere you went, there would be clues. You just had to keep your eyes open enough to spot the clues, understand them and put them in the big picture. A trip down memory lane to his early days as a beat cop were enough to put a smile back on Javea's face. The sun was out, the heat rising further and further. Summer was truly here to stay. The sound of the fighting cats lessened when he walked further away. It was replaced with a sound mix of traffic and calm. It was always the case in Javea that when you felt overwhelmed, that the calm was only a few moments away. And when you felt bored, the busy nature of the place was also only ever a few minutes away. When you lived here, you knew where to go, how to travel from one extreme to the other. Tourists that only came here for a few weeks a year couldn't quite get to grips with the place quickly enough to know where the extreme quiet was and where the extreme noise was. They existed in a place where both happened in the same place and time. You would think that the noise drowned out the quiet, but it didn't. Both occurred in tandem, defying the laws of sonics. There was the slightest breeze, almost imperceptible unless you looked at the very tops of the trees. They rustled slightly, giving up no sound but a movement that wasn't stillness. Javea knew that this meant the warmth from Africa was making its way across. This would be a hot week, maybe fortnight. After that, anything could happen. But while the wind was coming in from Africa, the outlook was for extreme heat. Javea loved living in one place for a big chunk of his life. It meant that he got to learn the little signs that let him know what the land was telling him. He loved knowing that the birds only built their nests when the rain was close to finished in the spring. He loved knowing the signs that summer was ending and turning to autumn. But he wasn't prepared for what he saw next. Chapter 38. Walking around the corner to Cal de Bologna, Javea was faced with 3 things that he didn't expect. First was an ambulance. It didn't look right. The paint on it was far too fresh for an older vehicle. Javea figured that this was the ambulance that had taken Hugo Cruz to the hospital and not delivered the supposedly injured man there. To someone who knew their vehicles, there would have been warning signs everywhere. To Javea, it looked off. To the doctor who dealt with Hugo, it didn't feel right, but not far enough wrong to alert him to the fact something suspicious was going on. The second thing he saw was Angelica. She had her head down like the weight of the world was pushing against it. Angelica was walking across Javea's direction, around 50 yards away. She didn't look up. A scooter sped past her. She stepped out into the road into the fumes created by the labouring machine. Another scooter followed around 20 seconds behind. Javea watched and feared that Angelica wouldn't make it across the street before the next scooter was upon her. It swerved past. Javea could see the driver consider using his horn before leaving it. He would have called her name, but for the third thing he saw. It was a figure in dark clothing, approximately halfway between Angelica and the ambulance. The dark figure was under the shade of the trees, the ones Javi had studied for the sign of a warm wind. He wore dark clothing against what most people were donned in with the summer heat. The man looked backwards and forwards between the ambulance and Angelica. Javi sensed danger. Chapter 39. The man looked across from the ambulance to Angelica again. It must have been the 10th time Javi had witnessed this head movement. But this time, the figure in dark also spied Javi when he scanned the nearby horizon between the vehicle and the woman. And that gave him the signal to get out of there. Far too many people. Far too much chance of being caught. As the man set off, Javi did exactly the same. His speed had left him in his 20s, but Javi felt like he had enough stamina for most, especially in this heat. The days of cycling and running in the heat of the Javea summer had set him up to last for hours. His friends saw it as madness. He saw it as part of living in a hot place. You still had to exercise. In the heat. Not all of us get up at 5 in the morning to utilise the cooler weather. The dark figure set off at some speed. He wasn't going to let his dark clothing stop him from getting away as fast as he could. Within a matter of seconds, he had opened up the distance between himself and Javi by a further 50 yards. He was going hell for leather. Angelica was still walking with her head down, unaware of the scene unfolding in front of her. It wasn't until she heard Javi call her name, out of breath, only 5 feet away as he ran, when she became conscious of what was going on. "Angelica!" he shouted again. She woke from her inner thoughts, took in the situation, and followed Javi. If he was chasing someone, then it was serious. If he was putting himself in danger, then she wanted to be part of it. It was exactly the thing she needed to break away from her thoughts of Patty and back to the world that was still spinning. She looked at Javi's feet. She already knew that he would be in walking boots. They were great for walking. Not the best footwear for running, but good enough. She looked at her feet and thanked herself for putting on a pair of trainers that morning instead of the summer sandals she fancied. Whatever Javi was chasing, it was worth following, she mused as she looked into the distance. It was the man she had followed from the scene of the killing. This was definitely worth chasing. Chapter 40. Javi finally closed in on the man. He estimated that he had given chase to the dark figure for around 1.5 miles, gradually seeing the gap between them whittle away by a few yards every minute or so. It was always going to be the long haul. Just how long on this hot day was farther than Javi's estimation as he set off. Most criminals would run away on the off chance that they got away with it, testing the water before giving up quite easily. If you didn't get away in the first 1/2 mile, then you were never going to get away. The longer time went on, the more opportunity the police chasing had to call for support, cars, helicopters and the like, and that was the end of the chase. Javi didn't have much in the way of backup. He could have called Kiki and asked her if she could locate a car in the nearby area, but seeing as he was chasing an unknown man for an unknown reason, it would be low on the list of priorities. As for a helicopter, that was well out of the question. But this guy was still going, flinching as he put as much effort in as he had to get away from the policeman and the curious woman chasing him. Angelica was around 20 yards behind Javi, who himself was about the same distance from the flare. She had no idea how she managed to keep up, but put it down to adrenaline coursing through her veins. As they reached the edge of the Arenal area, the man turned inland and upped his speed. One last attempt at getting away. They reached the bottom of the hills that stretched as far as the eye can see away from the Med and into the rest of the nation of Spain. The change in speed caught Javi off guard. He lost momentum and felt his diaphragm fight against his extra effort. He resisted the urge to vomit, and then he got back on with the job in hand. Angelica had anticipated the move. There was little else the guy could do to break the sequence of events that led to his capture. Just running and hoping the police would stop chasing was futile. She caught up to level with Javea. They smiled at each other as they matched stride. The sun was beating down on their heads. Angelica could think about nothing but a cold drink, but she knew that could be far off. The flare disappeared round a corner. Javea opened his stride to make up the ground, leaving Angelica a few steps behind. But that wasn't like Angelica. She thought a few steps ahead and cut to the street before. Javea chased hard up the hill, but found that his legs betrayed him. The man went right and then right again, out of the sight of Javea. The detective kicked to the ground, looking at the maze of streets and houses in front of him. The man could be in any garden, down any street, behind any fence. Right now, he could do with that helicopter. The man smiled as he walked slowly back down the hill, breathing deeply to restore the oxygen levels in his blood. If he was required to run again, then he would need all the recovery he could get. Looking up at the sky, he crouched down, walking as close to the ground as he could. He crept, trying not to give his position away in case those pursuing him were listening for any sound, any marker that could give away his location. He turned the corner with a smile that indicated he felt he had won. As he looked back down from the sun, his eyes took a few moments to refocus. When they did, he was face to face with the woman who had chased him twice in the last days, Angelica Boyle. Chapter 41. Kiki was frantically taking notes. The feelers she had put out to local solicitors had come back with an answer. A will. She checked it over. The thing looked legitimate, and it looked like the money in the mother's will was to be split evenly between her husband and her surviving son, Enrico's brother Flavio. The money had never been claimed and sat in a holding account administered by the state. But the phone call she was fielding at the time told a different story. It was another solicitor, with another will. This time, it left half of the money to the father, nothing to Flavio. And that will was from a later date than the one she had in her possession. The other half, Flavio's half if you like, was left to a company who she couldn't find any record of. The name was Livia of Rum. The internet, usually the mine of all information, had no record whatsoever of the company, and that worried her. Chapter 42. The man approached Angelica slowly, but with intent. She was stood between him and freedom, and that was a dangerous place to stand. Angelica watched the man as he walked towards her, looking left and right for a way out. There was none. Sure, he could climb the wall of a property and hope that he could get out of the other side, and hope that the policeman who was chasing him wasn't at the other side too. She was in a situation of danger and excitement, the very thing she had been craving for years. And now, she didn't know what to do. Angelica believed in situations like this that the remedy would appear when it was needed. She had been in a few scrapes like this and was still here to tell the tale. Maybe this was the one that ended her run of luck. Maybe. As he reached within a few feet, Angelica braced herself. If he tried to harm her, then the best bet was to get out of the way. She checked him out. Her guess was almost 6 foot tall and weighing a good double what she did. Angelica was sure it was the man who she had followed before, and she was about to find out how desperately he wanted to get away. She wanted to close her eyes and wait for the inevitable, but something inside forced her to keep them open. It wasn't bravery. Angelica had stack loads of bravery until the very moment she needed it. Her rush to get the adrenaline going lasted right until the very point she was in the most danger. Then all her body's signals said, "Get out of here, get home and make a nice cup of tea with your feet up on the sofa." Too late for that. The menace in the man's face contorted into something else as he got close enough to reach out and touch her. She didn't know what this new facial expression meant until he had acted a way that confirmed it. as he dropped to his knees and placed his hands over his face. The sobbing was evident. This large man looked like a small child on the ground, with tears running through his fingers and splashing all over his clothing. Angelica approached, put her arms around him, and listened to the crying. Chapter 43. As Angelica looked down at the man, the crying continued. In fact, it felt like the man would never stop. To Angelica, there was no consoling the guy. She had a child and knew when the tears were going to stop with Tommy. He would either run out of energy or crash or get over whatever it was that had upset him so much in the first place. But this man was different. The grief was all-consuming. He could cry all day and all night. She wanted to say something life-altering, something that changed whatever was inside him. There was no silver bullet in a situation like this. All she could muster was, "There." It was the two words her mother used to say when she cried inconsolably. The two words that she needed when she read the abusive texts. The two words she longed to hear from anyone when she felt all alone in this world. Instead, she got comfort from hearing them exit her mouth and enter the ears of the man dressed all in black, who had caused her to run nearly 2 miles in the extreme heat. Not someone she would have imagined she would have a great deal of sympathy for. Angelica looked up from the man, if only to give herself a few moments' respite from his troubles that took the air from around them. Negative energy dragged as much positive energy with it as it could, or as much as the positive energy would allow. Angelica allowed no more. As she looked up the street in the direction the man had come from, she saw Javea walk around the corner. He arrived with the two of them within 30 seconds, feeling no need to rush while the man was in such an obvious state of inaction. Arriving, he spoke. "I am Javea Jones. I am a detective with the Javea police. Who are you?" "My name is Flavio Moro." "The brother of Enrico?" "Yes, and I am out for revenge." Javea lifted the man to his feet with assistance from Angelica, but little in the way of assistance from the man himself. It was like the life had ebbed from him. "Flavio Moro, I am arresting you on suspicion of murder." Chapter 44. Back at the station, Kiki and Javea sat opposite Flavio Moro, waiting for him to pull himself together enough to answer questions. He had declined the presence of a lawyer, saying that he had nothing to hide. A few glasses of water later, he was ready to talk. "Flavio Moro, why did you run from me?" Javea decided to start with the facts. The more of these he could establish, the better his case was. And there was some psychology given to him in police training that the more you had someone sitting there saying the word yes, the better chance you had of getting them to say yes to the big question. But these were for later. To begin with, he needed to retrace the events that he could confirm himself. "I didn't know who you were, I just ran." "Do you normally run when you see someone else in the street?" "No." "So where this time?" "Something inside me told me I had to get out of there." "Did you know I was a detective?" "I had a good idea that you were with the local police. You guys all look the same. You did when my brother was killed. You do now. You will do in 100 years' time. If I still look like this in 100 years from now, then I'll consider it a success," Javea quipped. He needed thinking time. "I wouldn't," Flavio replied with disdain. "You lived here as a child?" "Yes." "With your family?" "Yes." "And your mother was quite the crusader in these parts?" "Yes." "You must be very proud." "Yes, I am." "And you ran from someone else recently, yes? From the scene of the death of Hugo Cruz?" "I'd rather you didn't say that name in my presence. That man doesn't deserve the dignity of a name." "And is that why you killed him?" Javea decided to go for the kill. No reason. Just wanted things to move forward as quickly as possible. And that time seemed good as any other. There had been enough uses of the word Yes. Me? You think I killed that thug? What else could I possibly think? I'm investigating the death of the thug who killed my brother. I want to make sure he is definitely dead. That man has slipped through the net far too many times already. My presence here is merely to confirm that one man is dead. And how did that lead you to the door of Artie Jackson? For the same reason as you. If you follow the timeline back, then you'll have to find out whether Artie Jackson was part of the plan, or whether he was a casualty of the plot to kill a man who should have been put to death many moons ago. And, Javea asked, knowing that Flavio had been to Artie Jackson's apartment. I'm not here to do your job for you, detective. You'll have to get off your backside and do that legwork for yourself. If you can't manage it, then ask one of your female friends. This one here looks twice the cop you are, and the one who stopped me where you couldn't. She's smarter than you, and you know it. Javea thought about Kiki and Angelica. They were both smart. Both were probably smarter than him. But that didn't stop him doing his job. He resolved to get Kiki the promotion she deserved, and he would try not to be so hard on Angelica when all she wanted to do was help. You mentioned getting revenge, Javea asked, confused. And the best revenge is to know that your enemy cannot do further harm to society, isn't it? It was Javea's turn to say, yes. There was no reason to keep Flavio Moro in custody. There was no evidence to link him to the death of Hugo Cruz, no matter how much he wanted the man to die. Flavio's taunting was the final insult. The man knew he was going to be released, and he was rubbing it in the detective's face. Flavio's last words when he left the interview room were, "So long." Javea had a million witty remarks lined up in his head to counter, but he knew they were all futile. Play the long game, Javea, he said to himself. Chapter 45. Angelica waited outside the police station. She was close enough to see if anyone left the place, but far enough away that she wasn't obviously sitting there waiting. The cover of a tree was matched with the cover of a scarf. She had grabbed a lift back with the police car that had taken Javea and Flavio back, and from there she had grabbed a cold drink to sip gently over the course of half an hour. That was the plan at any rate. And that was as close as Angelica had to a plan. She knew that someone exiting the police station was reason to watch and maybe follow. Whether that person was Javea, Kiki or Flavio was still to be determined. If it was either of those who worked for the police, then she would grab a coffee and chat. She hadn't spent any time at all with Kiki, but from the brief encounters she'd had, Kiki seemed really nice. Flavio was an altogether different character. He seemed evasive and emotional. The sound of his sobbing was still in her ears. It would remain there for some time. The breeze was warm. She wanted a cool breeze to counter the heat that seemed stuck on the streets of Javea, radiating from above with the sun, below with the pavement and all sides with the warm air. She didn't know how to get away from it outside the comfort of an air-conditioned building. It was her third summer in Javea, the start of her second full one, and she still hadn't managed to work out how to cope with the heat. The afternoon siesta seemed to be the only way the locals dealt with it. When it's too hot, then go to sleep until it cools down. Tommy was learning this way. His school had a siesta time where the kids slept on mats on the floor. Maybe there was nothing to it but to give up and follow the crowd. But Angelica was never one for following a crowd. She did things her own way. She had considered getting her long brunette hair chopped, cut back to a sensible length as her mother would put it. Angelica felt that her hair was part of her identity. She couldn't remember a time when she didn't have long hair, so that idea went out the window. Having her attention between the heat and the police station, Angelica slipped into some kind of stupor, one that only some movement from the police station door she was staring at would break. She ran the facts over in her head, the facts as she saw them. One man had been killed. Both her and Javea were now sure that wasn't accidental. The person who had died was a killer himself, albeit decades later. Then the man they now knew as Flavio Moro had run off, twice. That was more than a coincidence. As Angelica wandered, her mind turned things over and over. Something occurred to her. She hoped she would have had the time to explore her thoughts. As she wondered, the door of the police station filled with a figure in dark clothing. It was Flavio Moro. He left, looking around to make sure he wasn't being followed. Angelica looked the other way and counted to 15. She thought 10 was too little and 20 was too much. What if she turned around and he wasn't there at all? After 15, she looked back around and saw Flavio Moro walking in the direction of the Arenal. Angelica knew what was between the police station and the Arenal. It was a place where she and Javea had spotted him and the ambulance. Artie Jackson's place. She set off 100 yards behind. She wandered aimlessly at times, safe in the belief that if she lost sight of him, then she would catch him up at Artie Jackson's. Angelica followed the trail for 15 minutes and saw Flavio get close to Artie's place. He walked up the steps to the landing where the apartment was. By this point, Angelica had sped up, getting as close as she possibly could. Javea had mentioned Artie Jackson as they came back in the car in the brief conversation with Flavio, but that was about it. Angelica didn't have the exact address, but she did have a good idea of the location from the fact that was where Javea had started chasing Flavio. She crept up to the doorway once she knew Flavio was safely inside. She listened to the conversation that was quietly emanating from under the floor. "You've been spoken by the police. How can I trust you now? They have nothing on me. I was only there for half an hour. Most of that was me stalling." "And when did you leave the police station?" 5 minutes ago." "What? And you came straight here? You're leading them to me, stupid boy." "I wasn't followed. And if I wanted to lead the police to you, then they would be here right now, not me." "Good point. But that doesn't mean that I suddenly trust you." "Is that why you're pointing a gun at me?" Angelica gulped. She stepped away from the front door as silently as she could manage and dialed Javea. Chapter 46. Javea said he was on the way, but from the intonation in his voice, it didn't sound like he was in much of a hurry as Angelica would like him to be. She weighed up the situation. The only thing she felt she could do was stay close, listen in and wait for the cavalry to arrive. Angelica wandered slowly back up the stairs and across to the door. It was high risk. If the door opened and the man pointed his gun at her, then she was in real trouble. But what was the alternative? "You know I've already killed Hugo, and I'm more than happy to kill you too. I've waited a long time for this. You got in my way when you were a kid. You're not getting in my way now." Angelica had got back to the door just in time to hear these words uttered. This was the point in time when she decided that waiting for Javea wasn't going to produce the best outcome. It could all be over by the time he got there. Remembering cop shows from her childhood, Angelica smashed her shoulder into the door at the same height of the lock. It was surprisingly pliant, and she was inside within half a second. Chapter 47. The man in the middle of the room with a gun trained on Flavio turned his head first of all, then his body, and then finally the arm that held the gun. Flavio now wasn't in the direct line of the gun. Angelica was. Angelica gazed at the man with a puzzled look. Then it clicked. The guess she had was that the father was still alive. This was an older, rounder version of Flavio, right down to the posture and the way he moved. The father was walking towards Angelica. "Dad, don't!" Flavio shouted. Confirmation. He didn't just look like Flavio, he was Flavio's father. Angelica had developed a hunch that the father was still on the planet, and a further hunch that he was behind the death of Hugo Cruz, a death that was now most definitely a murder. "I always said I'd get my revenge on Hugo Cruz. I had to go underground for years when my beautiful wife died. Too much publicity made it impossible for me to be the shadow I needed to be in order to get the man. People have short memories. Hugo Cruz was accepted into the community as rehabilitated, but not to me he wasn't. To me, he was a cold-blooded killer. He robbed Enrico of his rightful life. It took some time, but now I have robbed him of his future." "Wasn't he rehabilitated? Can't people change?" Angelica asked. She wanted to take his attention away from the deadly weapon in his hand. "Some people change. Like this wet blanket here," the father said, pointing at Flavio. "Me?" Flavio protested. "Yes, you. I gave you the chance to help get revenge on your brother's murder, and you turned me down. You have changed. When Enrico died, you spoke eloquently about revenge. You spoke about getting even, then you wimped out. Enrico is looking down on you from heaven with tears in his eyes. Dad, he's looking at you with tears in his eyes. Do you really think that Enrico would want another human being killed in his name? As soon as I heard Hugo Cruz was killed, I knew it was you. I had to investigate. I had to get my revenge, but that revenge wasn't on Hugo. It was on you. How dare you take my brother's name, his legacy, and turn it into this? You're no father. I'm twice the man you are, which is why I deserve all the money left by your mother. The cash was all coming to me. You have nothing. The company set up in your name, Livia of Rome, an anagram of your name, was solely owned by me. You signed your rights away to this company 2 weeks ago. The form I signed. You told me this was to ensure I got all of the money. You lied. And that wasn't the worst thing I did over the last few weeks, and I'm just about to do it all again." Chapter 48. The father turned the gun on his own son. Flavio had pushed enough buttons to rile up his own father. The man's attention on Angelica had turned into anger directed at someone he wanted a different life for. That was never going to be a life that Flavio would accept. As the man built up the courage to put a bullet into his own child, Angelica looked around for something to stop the events unfolding, but she could see nothing. The door to another room was ajar, and this was the first time she became aware of a smell coming from there. It was nasty, like an evil was emanating from there. All 3 occupants of the room closed their eyes. Flavio closed his eyes in fear. His father closed his eyes so he didn't see what he was about to do. Angelica closed her eyes for pretty much the same reason. This wasn't an image she wanted to carry with her for the rest of her life. She wouldn't be able to erase the sounds, but the sights were something else. Before she felt the bravery to open her eyes again, Angelica heard 3 bangs. Opening her eyes, she saw Javea on top of the father who had let go of the gun by that point. The first bang was Javea bursting through the door to enter the apartment. The second bang was the father pulling the trigger as Javea reached him. The bullet was embedded in the ceiling. Third bang was Javea and the father crashing into the coffee table behind them as they landed. Chapter 49. "Thank goodness that's all over," Angelica whispered in Javea's ear. She looked down at his naked chest. The heat was evident. "I know. The first time is always the worst," he whispered back, getting closer to her so she could hear. "The first time you hear a gun go off?" Angelica asked. "Yes." Then a splash of water went over both of them. Tommy stood there with his rubber rings slipping down his arms and what felt like half the swimming pool dripping off him. The 3 of them laughed. The danger of the previous few days felt like a long way in the past. Javea had taken the father, who was also called Flavio, to the police station, processed him for arrest and interviewed him. He would take a statement from Flavio Jr. and Angelica the next day. He'd had enough for one day. He took the rest of the afternoon off, went with Angelica to pick Tommy up from school, and then sat by the edge of the swimming pool watching the boy have more fun than a 6-year-old could have anywhere else on the planet. The father had killed Hugo and Artie. His plan was to kill the man who had killed his son. He had succeeded, but he would face justice for his deeds. The laughter stopped for Angelica when her phone pinged. It was another abusive message. The end.